In this video, we're taking a look at some of my favorite combinations in the Southeast Gassers Association. Now, if you follow my channel, you've seen some coverage from Southeast Gassers events, but most of the time that's just raw action. I don't do any editing or any voiceovers. I don't tell you anything about the combinations. I just show you the wheels up, heads up action. And we're going to show a little bit of that at the end of this video, but I wanted to talk about some of my favorite combos here. And there's tons of great variety within this group, lots of great period correct combinations, and lots of great combinations that perform very well. So just because I'm not including them in this video doesn't mean that it's not cool or not an awesome combination. I just picked out a handful of really cool cars to show you from the most recent event at Knoxville Dragway. Every car within this group has to follow a very strict rules package, and that applies both to appearance and performance. So performance parameters are based on cubic inches versus the weight of the vehicle, and then there's a lot of other parameters in there as well. And then the appearance package, I mean, these cars have to have hand lettering, they have to have appropriate wheels, the stance has to be right. There's a lot of factors that go into creating a Southeast Gassers Association legal car. So the first one we're going to look at today is a super stock car, and the one that jumps out to me is this 63 two-door post Chevrolet. And the reason why it stands out is because it has an actual 409 under the hood. You can see all the markings on the outside, but very rarely do you see somebody use a 409 based engine because they're finicky. They're hard to deal with. They don't last a long time, and they don't make quite as much power as a conventional big block Chevy or small block Chevy in certain cases. But in this case, Rob Walden, who's the son of Lamar Walden, he knows his way around a 409 engine, and he's built a serious combination for the Superstock class. One of the most traditional cars in this group is this 57 Chevy. And this particular one has a very traditional engine combination. It's got an old school small block with a cross ram intake manifold, 2 4s. This is not your typical Southeast Gassers combination, but it runs really good. It's a small cubic inch combination. It runs in the C gas category, which is 10 pounds per cubic inches. So let's say it's a 3,000 pound car. That means it's 300 cubic inches or less. And this thing screams, it makes a lot of good power, and it even has a very old school suspension style. Now, all these cars are required to have vintage style suspension, but this one has a transverse leaf spring instead of parallel leafs. So this is like a 32 Ford style front axle and spring setup, and it even has vintage Ford split wishbones. And this is just a really traditional 60s style suspension setup. And it even has some cool chains to limit the front suspension travel. This is a great historical piece that shows what drag racing was really like in the 60s. Here's another cool C-Gas car, this time an early Corvette, and this thing's got a great stance, slotted mags, and it's got some very nice lettering. You see that gold leaf with the shadows. I mean, somebody did some killer work there. It's got a really cool looking hand-formed aluminum scoop, and as we back up here, you can see this thing has a great gasser stance. The next car we're going to look at is from the B gas category, which these cars are required to weigh 8 pounds per cubic inch, and that makes this a very competitive class. The racing is really tight in this class, and it creates some great combinations. Now, this particular car is a 33 Willys sedan delivery. It's got a mechanically fuel-injected small block Chevy, obviously a 4-speed transmission, because all cars in the Southeast Gassers Association have to have a 4-speed transmission. And you can see this thing is named Loose Cannon, and this car typically lives up to that name because it's unpredictable. Short wheelbase, these things launch super hard. You never know which direction they're going to go, which is part of the reason why people love to watch these cars. Here's another personal favorite from the B-Gas category. This is a 37 or 38 Chevrolet sedan. You can see it's got a slick paint job, nice little subtle lettering. You can see it's got a sheet metal scoop up there, and it has a one-way technology 374 cubic inch engine under the hood. Next up is A-Gas, and that's the absolute quickest and fastest cars in the Southeast Gassers Association. These cars weigh 6 pounds per cubic inch. You'll see lots of big block combinations in this class, big horsepower, a lot of Gene Fulton horsepower in this class, and these guys absolutely put it all on the line. One example we're looking at here is Barry Lynn's Chevelle station wagon, a 2-door station wagon that's been cut up and turned into a gasser. You can see Little Red Wagon on the doors, and under the flip front end is a big block Chevy, the old school bread box style tunnel ram, 2.4s obviously, huge white headers, great stance, great sheet metal scoop. This is a perfect example of a period correct gasser. Now, if there was a Best Appearing or Best Engineered award, this 41 Willys would take it, in my opinion. This car is beautiful. The details on it, the paint job, the lettering, and of course it has a Gene Fulton big block. Let's see, another one of those Edelbrock tunnel rams, 2 Holley 4-barrels, magnesium wheels. Every detail on this car is beautiful. The fit and finish is right on the money. This thing has a lot of great details on the inside as well. You can see about the only not old school thing that I'm seeing in here is the tachometer. Everything else on this car looks like it came straight out of a 1960s hot rod magazine. This is a top-notch gasser. Here's a little closer look at another A-Gas car. This is Ben Christopher's Chevy 2, and you can see with the front end up and the door off of it, you can see the skeleton of this thing. This is not just an old piece together car. This is a fine-tuned chassis with a fine-tuned Jason line big block, tunnel ram 2.4s, the whole combination. You can see inside it's all business. This is a very lightweight car and a very competitive car in the A-gas class. I couldn't do a gasser video without talking a little bit about a Henry J. And this 51 Henry J competes in the A-gas category. You can see he's sponsored by Mountain Creek Harley-Davidson. This combination looks cool and it runs good, and I just always love to see a Henry J gasser. Now, unfortunately, I missed the H-gas action at Knoxville Dragway this last time, but I wanted to talk about an H-gas car that really got my attention earlier in the season. Now, this car is an Anglia that has a chopped top, and it has a very interesting engine because the H-gas class is geared towards 6 cylinders, 4 cylinders, and even flathead Ford V8s. And this particular car has a Pontiac 4-cylinder, which is essentially a half of a 389 engine. That means that aftermarket cylinder heads are an option. You got lots of different combinations for bore and stroke that make these things really rev to the moon. In this particular car, this thing has some cool history too. So as I've seen this car progress, I knew that Zach Hall was originally the one who dragged this thing out and started putting it back together. And judging by the body modifications and the old paint that was on it, I knew this thing had some great drag racing history. And I stumbled across an old picture of this car from Bristol in 1980 at the Fall Bracket Nationals. And you can see very clearly that the top is chopped in the same manner. This car has the same attitude, and that really put all the pieces together because this car was actually based out of West Virginia. And in this configuration, it ran a 340 based Mopar engine with an automatic transmission. It was just a bracket car by this point. But previously, this thing actually had a blown Hemi engine. It was set up for AA gas, and it was built by Buck Travis, also out of West Virginia. Unfortunately, the car never really got to hit the track in that blown Hemi configuration, but then Rick Austin bought it from Buck and put his engine and transmission in it and went drag racing with it in the 70s and 80s and ultimately sold the car, and it was dismantled from there. But it's so cool that this thing ended up back on the track, especially with the Southeast Gassers group, because there's a lot of cool cars and a lot of period correct cars, but there are very few cars that have actual drag racing history. Another class in the Southeast Gassers Association is AFX. Now, these cars are not technically gassers, and these are the only cars in the whole group that are allowed to run on other fuel besides gasoline. So these cars run on alcohol, they're all mechanically fuel injected, and you can see the different cars have different attitudes, but almost all of them have an altered wheelbase. So the rear axle has been moved forward, and in some cases the front axle has also been moved forward. And these cars are not quite as quick as the A-gas cars, but they definitely put on a show, and it adds a little bit of variety to this event. And in this class, there's some great tribute cars and some great cars that really tell the story of how these altered wheelbase cars turned into what we now know as funny cars. And I plan on doing a video that shows you that transformation soon. I'm going to showcase several altered wheelbase cars, and talk about all those changes that happened from around 1964 to about 1967 when these cars were really transforming quickly. So stay tuned for that. But for now, let's take a look at some of the early action from the most recent Southeast Gassers event at Knoxville Dragway. There's still more chances to see this group in action in 2025. You can go see them at Gulfport Dragway. There's actually a double header event where they have a Friday night drag race and a Saturday drag race in conjunction with Cruising the Coast. Big time event there. Lots of people are going to come see that. And then, of course, the finals at Shadyside. So a lot of opportunities still to see these cars in action. I encourage you to see them in person, but if you can't make it, you can check out other people's videos. There's a lot of great content, including the Southeast Gassers Association YouTube channel. You can check them out. You can check them out on Facebook and Instagram. They post a lot of great content.